Welcome to the world of science fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe, so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy the listening. Captain Darius Hale adjusted his thermal suit as he stared out through the frost-covered viewport of his mech, Vanguard 12. The frigid winds of Arion 6 howled outside, battering against the machine's reinforced hull. The digital readout blinked a steady reminder of his isolation, -70 degrees Fahrenheit. "Control," he muttered into his comms, "this is Hale on patrol route Gamma 3. Nothing to report except ice, and more ice." "Copy that, Captain," came the static-laden reply from Control. "Try not to freeze out there." Darius smirked faintly but didn't respond. 15 years on this frozen wasteland had dulled his sense of humor. He maneuvered Vanguard 12 over a jagged ridge when his sensors pinged, an anomaly beneath the ice. "What the hell?" he murmured as he adjusted the radar settings. A faint metallic signature flickered on his display. Protocol dictated that he report any anomalies immediately, but something about this felt different. With practiced precision, he activated Vanguard 12's ground-penetrating radar and zoomed in on the signal. It wasn't just metal, it was a chamber buried deep beneath layers of ancient ice. Darius hesitated only briefly before overriding Control's warnings about leaving his mech in extreme conditions. He stepped out into the biting cold, his boots crunching against the frozen surface as he activated his helmet's floodlights. The beam illuminated something extraordinary, a crystalline sarcophagus embedded in the ice. Inside lay a figure, a woman with skin like glacial frost and features so striking they seemed otherworldly. "What are you?" he whispered under his breath. He deployed his plasma cutter and began melting through the ice with painstaking care. Minutes stretched into an hour before he finally freed the sarcophagus from its icy prison. His breath caught as he examined her closer, her skin shimmered faintly under the light, and her silver hair framed a serene expression. Against all better judgment, Darius activated his emergency thawing kit. The sarcophagus hissed as it warmed, steam rising into the frigid air around him. The ice melted away slowly until only she remained, motionless but pristine. Then her eyes snapped open. Darius stumbled back instinctively, hand reaching for his sidearm as those eyes, liquid silver pools, locked onto him. She sat up gracefully within the sarcophagus, seemingly unbothered by her nudity or surroundings. "You have nothing to fear from me," she said softly, her voice melodic yet unfamiliar in its cadence. Darius froze in place, torn between protocol and curiosity. What are you?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed despite his thermal suit. "My name is Caliph," she replied after a pause. "And I am not your enemy." Her calm demeanor disarmed him more than any weapon could have. Against every regulation drilled into him over years of service, Darius shrugged off his outer thermal layer and handed it to her. "You're going to freeze if you don't cover up," he said gruffly. Caliph smiled faintly, a gesture both alien and strangely human, as she accepted the garment and draped it over herself. "The cold does not harm me," she said simply but added after a moment's thought, "though I appreciate your kindness." Darius frowned slightly but didn't press further. Instead, he gestured toward Vanguard 12. "We need to get back to base before someone notices I've gone off-grid." Caliph nodded and followed him without protest. As they climbed into the mech's cockpit together, a tight fit that brought them uncomfortably close, Darius couldn't help but notice how her presence seemed to alter even the air around them. "Why were you frozen out here?" he asked as Vanguard 12 lumbered back toward Omega Base. Caliph's gaze remained fixed on the horizon outside as she replied cryptically, "To protect what must not be lost." Her words lingered in Darius's mind long after they returned to base, a riddle wrapped in mystery that would soon unravel into something far greater than either of them could imagine. The sterile lights of Omega Base's medical wing hummed faintly as Captain Darius Hale sat in the corner of the observation room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Across from him, Caliph sat on the edge of a medical examination table, her icy blue skin glowing faintly under the harsh lighting. Despite her otherworldly appearance, she seemed calm, almost serene, as Dr. Leora Venn, the base's xenobiologist, scanned her with a handheld device. Darius had been ordered to bring Caliph to the medical wing for observation and testing after their return to base. Protocol demanded it, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. He'd seen how quickly humans turned on things they didn't understand. Her physiology is remarkable, Dr. Venn muttered, her voice tinged with both awe and suspicion. She adjusted her glasses and glanced at Darius. Captain Hale, are you sure she's not dangerous? Caliph tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes locking onto Dr. Venn. If I were dangerous, would I not have acted by now? Dr. Venn flinched at the sound of Caliph's voice, so calm yet so commanding, and returned to her scans without responding. Darius leaned forward in his chair. Look, Doc, I've spent enough time in combat to know when someone's a threat. She's not here to hurt us. Not yet, Dr. Venn murmured under her breath before addressing Caliph directly. Your body temperature is far below what should be survivable for any living organism. How is that possible? Caliph smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. My kind are adapted to environments far colder than this one. The cold is familiar to me. And your kind would be? Dr. Venn pressed. Caliph hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. We are called the Elisari. Darius frowned. He'd never heard of them before. Not in any reports or intelligence briefings about alien species encountered during humanity's expansion into space. Dr. Venn scribbled something on her data pad before asking, why were you frozen out there? What were you doing on Arion 6? Caliph's expression darkened slightly, and for the first time since they'd found her, Darius thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. I was placed in stasis, she said softly, to preserve what little remained of my people. Dr. Venn paused mid-scribble and looked up sharply. Your people? Are there more of you? Caliph shook her head slowly. No. I am the last. The weight of those words hung heavily in the air, silencing both Darius and Dr. Venn for a moment. What happened to them? Darius asked gently. Caliph's gaze shifted to him, and he felt an inexplicable pull in those silver eyes, like staring into an endless winter sky. They were consumed by war, she said finally. A war much like the one your people now fight against the freezers. At the mention of humanity's most feared enemy, the ice-generating aliens that had been waging war against human colonies for decades, Dr. Venn stiffened visibly. You're saying you know about the freezers? She asked cautiously. Caliph nodded. I know them well. Darius leaned forward even more now, his curiosity piqued despite himself. How? Are they connected to your people? Caliph hesitated again before answering. The freezers are not what you believe them to be, she said cryptically. What does that mean? Dr. Venn demanded, frustration creeping into her voice. Before Caliph could respond, an alarm blared through the base's intercom system, a shrill sound that sent a chill down Darius's spine. Attention all personnel, a voice crackled over the speakers. Perimeter breach detected. Freezer units inbound. Darius shot to his feet instinctively, his hand already reaching for his sidearm out of habit. He glanced at Caliph, who remained seated but looked deeply troubled. They're here, she murmured softly. Dr. Venn paled visibly and clutched her datapad tightly to her chest. Captain Hale, we need to get her secured immediately. If they're coming for her. They're not coming for me, Caliph interrupted firmly as she stood from the table with an almost regal grace. Then why are they here? Darius asked sharply. Caliph met his gaze evenly, unflinching despite the chaos erupting around them outside the medical wing. They're here because they sense my presence, she said simply. And because they fear what I might reveal to you. Darius exchanged a tense look with Dr. Venn before making a snap decision. We don't have time for this, he said urgently as he grabbed Kalitha's arm, not roughly but firmly enough to convey his intent, and began leading her toward the exit. Where are you taking her? Dr. Venn called after him. To safety, Darius replied without looking back. The corridors of Omega Base were a flurry of activity as soldiers rushed past them toward defensive positions and alarms continued to blare overhead. Darius kept Kalith close by his side as he navigated through the chaos toward one of the secure bunkers deeper within the facility. You don't have to protect me, Kalith said quietly as they moved swiftly through the base. Darius glanced at her briefly but didn't slow down or loosen his grip on her arm. You're under my watch now, he said simply. They reached the bunker just as another explosion rocked the base, a distant rumble that sent vibrations through the floor beneath their feet. Inside, several other civilians and non-combat personnel huddled together nervously while soldiers stood guard at the entrance with weapons drawn. Stay here, Darius instructed Kalith as he guided her toward a corner away from prying eyes and ears. What will you do? She asked softly. Darius hesitated for only a moment before replying, my job. With that, he turned and left the bunker without another word, his mind racing with questions about who, or what, Kalith really was and how she fit into this escalating conflict between humans and freezers. Back on the battlefield outside Omega Base's perimeter walls, Darius piloted Vanguard 12 into position alongside several other mechs as they prepared to engage incoming freezer units, towering crystalline creatures that seemed almost impervious to conventional weaponry. As he fired round after round at their advancing forms while dodging their icy projectiles with practiced precision honed over years of combat experience against these relentless foes, it struck him how little humanity truly understood about their enemy despite decades spent fighting them tooth and nail across countless frozen worlds like Arion 6. And somewhere deep inside him, a small voice whispered that maybe Kalith held answers no one else could provide. The conference room buzzed with tension, the air thick with mistrust and unease. Colonel Yarrick Tan, Omega Base's commander, stood at the head of the table, his jaw clenched as he glared at Kalith. The alien woman sat calmly in her chair, her icy blue skin glowing faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. Captain Darius Hale stood beside her, his posture rigid but protective. Let me get this straight, Colonel Tan said, his voice sharp and commanding. You're claiming that the freezers, the creatures who've killed thousands of our people, are not our enemies? Kalith met his gaze evenly, her silver eyes unwavering. They are not your enemies in the way you perceive them. Tan slammed his fist on the table, causing several data pads to rattle. Enough riddles. If they're not our enemies, then why do they attack our colonies? Why do they kill our soldiers? Kalitha's expression remained serene, though there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. They attack because they believe you are a threat to the balance. Balance? Dar. Leora Venn asked from her seat across the table. The xenobiologist leaned forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. What kind of balance? Kalith turned to her, her voice soft but firm. The balance between worlds. The Elisari, my people, were guardians of this balance for centuries. When humanity began expanding into space, they unknowingly disrupted it. Darius frowned, his mind racing to make sense of her words. Disrupted how? Kalith hesitated for a moment before answering. The freezers are not invaders, they are protectors of worlds that cannot sustain human presence. Your colonies on frozen planets like Arion 6 threaten ecosystems that have existed for millennia. The freezers act to preserve what you would destroy. The room fell silent as everyone processed the weight of her revelation. So you're saying this war is our fault? Colonel Tan said bitterly. Kalith shook her head slightly. Fault is irrelevant. What matters is understanding. Understanding won't bring back the lives we've lost, Tan shot back. No, Kalith agreed quietly, but it might prevent more loss. Darius stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. If what she's saying is true, Then we've been fighting a war based on a misunderstanding. And you believe her? Tan challenged. Darius met his commander's gaze without flinching. I believe she knows more about the freezers than we ever could. Tan scoffed and turned to Dr. Venn. Doctor, what's your assessment? Is she lying? Dr. Venn glanced at Caliph before replying cautiously. Her physiology is unlike anything we've encountered before, but I haven't found any signs of deception in her behavior or responses. Tan's expression darkened as he looked back at Caliph. Even if she's telling the truth, it doesn't change the fact that the freezers are actively trying to wipe us out. Caliph's gaze softened as she spoke again. They do not seek to wipe you out, they seek to protect what remains of their worlds. Then why did they attack this base? Tan demanded. Caliph hesitated again before answering. Because they sense my presence here. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers as everyone tried to make sense of her statement. What does that mean? Dr. Venn asked. Caliph looked down briefly, as if gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was tinged with sorrow. I was placed in stasis on Arion 6 to prevent further conflict between my people and yours. My awakening has disturbed that fragile peace. Darius felt a pang of guilt as he realized the implications of his actions in thawing her out. So you're saying this is your fault? Tan said coldly. Caliph looked up at him, her silver eyes filled with resolve. It is my responsibility. Before anyone could respond, an alarm blared through the base's intercom system, a sound that sent chills down Darius's spine. Attention all personnel, a voice crackled over the speakers. Freezer units detected approaching the perimeter. Prepare for immediate engagement. Colonel Tan cursed under his breath and turned to Darius sharply. Captain Hale, get to your mech and prepare for battle. Darius nodded and started toward the door but stopped when he felt Caliph's hand on his arm. Wait, she said softly. He turned to face her, his heart racing as he saw the determination in her eyes. I can help, she said. How? He asked skeptically. Caliph stood and addressed the room with quiet authority. I can communicate with them. Tan laughed bitterly. Communicate? They don't talk, they kill. They will listen to me, Caliph insisted. And why should we trust you? Tan challenged. Caliph met his gaze evenly once more. Because I am their guardian. The room fell silent again as everyone grappled with the gravity of her words. Darius stepped forward and looked at Tan directly. Sir, if there's even a chance she can stop this attack without bloodshed, we have to let her try. Tan stared at him for a long moment before finally relenting with a heavy sigh. Fine, but if she betrays us, it's on your head. Darius nodded firmly and turned back to Caliph. Let's go. Outside Omega Base's perimeter walls, Darius piloted Vanguard 12 alongside several other mechs as they prepared for combat against the approaching freezer units, towering crystalline creatures that glowed faintly in the icy darkness. Caliph sat beside him in the cockpit, her presence both calming and unnerving at once. They won't attack immediately, she said quietly as she stared out at the advancing figures. How do you know? Darius asked. They are waiting for me, she replied simply. Darius glanced at her briefly before activating his comm system and addressing the other pilots. Hold fire until I give the order. What? One pilot protested over the channel. Captain Hale, those things are closing in fast. Just hold fire. Darius repeated firmly. The mechs held their positions as Caliph opened the cockpit hatch and stepped out into the freezing air without hesitation or fear. Darius watched anxiously as she approached the freezer units alone, her blue skin glowing faintly like theirs against the backdrop of snow and ice. She stopped several meters away from them and raised her hand slowly, a gesture that seemed both peaceful and commanding at once. The freezers paused their advance and stood motionless before her, a sight that left everyone watching speechless. Caliph began speaking in a language Darius couldn't understand, a series of melodic tones and harmonies that seemed to resonate through the air itself. To his astonishment, one of the freezer units responded in kind, its crystalline form vibrating slightly as it emitted similar tones back at her. For several minutes, they exchanged sounds that seemed almost musical in nature until finally Caliph turned back toward Omega Base and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They will not attack if you agree to leave this world untouched." Colonel Tan's voice crackled over Darius's comm system angrily, "Leave untouched? We've invested years into colonizing this planet." Darius activated his comms mic again and replied firmly, "Sir, maybe it's time we rethink what we're fighting for." As Caliph stood between humanity's machines and alien protectors, her presence bridging two worlds divided by fear, the icy battlefield seemed less like a place of war, and more like a chance for peace waiting to be thawed from its frozen depths. The conference room was tense, filled with the base's top brass and armed guards standing watch. Captain Darius Hale stood beside Caliph, who had been moved from the observation deck to this secure location. The air was thick with skepticism as General Hawthorne glared at Caliph, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Let's cut to the chase," Hawthorne said, his voice booming. "What are you? Why should we believe anything you say?" Caliph remained calm, her silver eyes scanning the room. "I am Caliph, the last of the Elisari. I was placed in stasis to protect the balance between worlds." "Balance?" Tan scoffed from his seat. "What balance? You mean the balance between your kind and the freezers? We've lost too many lives to trust you." Caliph took a deep breath, her composure unwavering. "You misunderstand. The freezers are not your enemies, they are guardians of their worlds, just as I am a guardian of mine." Darius felt a surge of frustration at the disbelief radiating from his fellow officers. "You all heard her during the attack. She communicated with them. They didn't fire on us because she was there." Hawthorne waved a dismissive hand. "That doesn't mean she's not a threat." Her core temperature dropped to match theirs. "She could be one of them." Caliph stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I am not one of them. I was frozen to prevent conflict between our species. My awakening has disrupted that balance." "Disrupted it how?" Tan pressed, leaning forward in his chair. Caliph's gaze softened as she spoke. "When humanity began colonizing frozen planets like Arion 6, you encroached upon ecosystems that have existed for millennia. The freezers act to preserve their worlds from what they see as invasive forces." Darius watched as skepticism flickered across the faces of the assembled officers. He knew they were grappling with a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. "So you're saying we should just pack up and leave?" Colonel Tan challenged. "No," Caliph replied firmly. "What I'm saying is that understanding can lead to coexistence rather than conflict. The freezers do not wish to destroy humanity, they wish to protect their home." General Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "And what do you propose we do? Just sit down for tea and discuss our differences?" Caliph's expression remained resolute. "If you allow me to mediate, I can help establish communication with the freezers. We can find a way to coexist peacefully." Darius felt a flicker of hope at her words but knew that convincing the others would be an uphill battle. "Captain Hale," Hawthorne said suddenly, turning his attention to Darius. "You've been close to her since she arrived. Do you believe her?" Darius hesitated for a moment, weighing his words carefully before responding. "I do believe her, sir. She saved us from an attack by communicating with them. If we don't try to understand their perspective, we risk losing everything." Tan shook his head in disbelief. "And what if she's wrong? What if this is all a ploy?" Caliph stepped forward again, her voice unwavering as she addressed Tan directly. "If I wanted to harm humanity, I would have done so already when I was awakened from my stasis." The room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Finally, Hawthorne sighed heavily and leaned forward in his chair, looking directly at Caliph. If we agree to this mediation, what guarantees do we have that you won't betray us? I cannot promise safety, Caliph replied honestly, but I can promise my commitment to peace. Darius felt a surge of admiration for her courage in facing such scrutiny. Very well, Hawthorne said reluctantly after a long pause. We'll give you one chance, one opportunity to prove your intentions are genuine. Caliph nodded solemnly, gratitude shining in her silver eyes. But know this, Hawthorne continued, his tone serious. If anything goes wrong, if any harm comes to our people, you will be held accountable. I understand, Caliph said quietly. As Darius and Caliph left the conference room together, he couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and hope about what lay ahead. You did well in there, he said softly as they walked down the corridor. Caliph looked at him with appreciation in her eyes. Thank you for believing in me. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything, Darius admitted as they approached the hangar bay where several mechs were stationed for potential deployment against freezer units. Caliph paused outside the hangar door and turned to face him fully. What do you fear most about this situation? Darius considered her question carefully before answering. I fear that we might lose more lives if we don't find a way to communicate with them effectively. Caliph nodded thoughtfully. That is a valid concern. As they entered the hangar bay together, Darius noticed several pilots preparing their mechs for potential engagement with freezer units outside the base perimeter. Captain Hale, one of the pilots called out as he approached them, concern etched on his face. Are we really trusting this alien? What if she's leading us into a trap? Darius felt irritation flare within him but kept his voice steady as he replied, Caliph is not our enemy. She wants peace, just like we do. The pilot scoffed but didn't push further as Darius moved past him with Caliph by his side. Are you ready for this? Darius asked Caliph as they reached Vanguard 12. I am, she replied confidently. He climbed into the cockpit and activated the systems before extending a hand toward her, an invitation for her to join him inside. As she settled into place beside him, Darius felt an electric charge fill the air between them, a connection that transcended their differences. Let's hope we can make this work, he said quietly as he prepared for takeoff. With that, they launched into the icy expanse outside Omega Base, a world filled with uncertainty but also possibility, a chance for understanding amidst chaos. As Vanguard 12 soared through the frozen skies above Arion 6, Darius focused on navigating toward where freezer units had been sighted earlier, a location where communication could potentially take place without immediate conflict. Do you see them? Caliph asked quietly as she peered out through the cockpit viewport. Darius scanned the landscape below and spotted movement among clusters of ice formations, a group of freezers moving cautiously through their territory. There they are, he confirmed, pointing toward their crystalline forms gliding effortlessly across the ice. Caliph took a deep breath and closed her eyes briefly before speaking softly into their comm system, freezers. I am Caliph of Elisari. I come in peace. For several moments nothing happened, only silence echoed through their comm system, but then one of the freezer units turned toward them and began emitting low-frequency sounds that resonated through the air like music carried on the wind. They're responding. Caliph exclaimed excitedly. Darius felt a rush of adrenaline course through him as he listened intently, trying to decipher what was being communicated between Caliph and these alien beings who had once been viewed solely as enemies. As Caliph spoke again, her voice weaving seamlessly into an ancient melody, the atmosphere shifted around them, tension slowly giving way to something more profound, an understanding that had long been buried beneath layers of fear and mistrust. And in that moment, amidst swirling snowflakes dancing around Vanguard 12, Darius realized that perhaps this was just the beginning, an opportunity for healing rather than destruction, an awakening not just for Caliph but for all those who had fought so hard against an enemy they never truly understood. As he piloted onward into uncharted territory, the future stretched before them like an endless expanse of ice waiting patiently for warmth, waiting patiently for change. The secure conference room felt less like a place of diplomacy and more like a cage. General Hawthorne's skepticism hung heavy in the air, and Colonel Tan's distrust was a palpable force. Caliph stood tall, her icy blue skin shimmering under the harsh lights, facing humanity's judgment. Captain Darius Hale stood beside her, his commitment unwavering, despite the doubt swirling around them. "Explain this balance," Hawthorne demanded, his voice echoing in the confined space. "What are these freezers protecting us from?" Caliph met his gaze. "Not from you, General. They are protecting their ecosystems. The worlds you colonize, the ice planets you see as barren, are teeming with life unique to those environments. The freezers are the guardians of that life, ensuring its survival." "So, you're saying we're the bad guys?" Tan spat, his face reddening. "We're just trying to survive." "Survival shouldn't come at the cost of another's existence," Caliph responded calmly. "There are ways to coexist, to find harmony instead of destruction." Darius stepped forward, adding his voice to the plea. "We've seen what Caliph can do. She communicated with them, stopped an attack. Isn't that worth exploring?" Hawthorne remained impassive. "And what's your solution, Captain?" "We abandon our colonies, leave these planets undefended?" "Not abandon, adapt," Caliph countered. "Learn to live in harmony with these worlds. Understand the freezer's intentions. I can help you. I can mediate." The silence stretched, thick with tension. Finally, Hawthorne spoke, his voice grudging. "All right, we'll play your game. But you're walking on thin ice, Caliph. One wrong move, and this whole thing falls apart." Caliph nodded, her silver eyes filled with resolve. "I understand." The first meeting with the freezers was fraught with anxiety. Darius piloted Vanguard 12, with Caliph beside him, towards a designated neutral zone on the icy plains. A small fleet of human ships hung back, a silent, watchful presence. As they approached, a group of freezers emerged from the icy landscape, their crystalline forms towering over them. "Are you nervous?" Darius asked, glancing at Caliph. "Apprehensive," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I have hope." As Vanguard 12 touched down, Caliph stepped out into the freezing air, her blue skin glowing faintly. She raised her hands in a gesture of peace, and the freezers responded in kind, their crystalline bodies emitting a low, resonant hum. Darius watched from the cockpit as Caliph began to communicate, her voice weaving into the alien tones of the freezers. The exchange was slow, cautious, but it was happening. They were talking. Hours passed as Caliph mediated between the two species, explaining humanity's intentions, pleading for understanding, and conveying the freezers' concerns about the encroachment on their worlds. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Finally, as the icy sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Caliph turned back to Darius, her expression hopeful. "They are willing to listen," she announced. "They are willing to consider coexistence." The negotiations that followed were long and arduous, filled with setbacks and compromises. But Caliph's presence was a constant source of strength and understanding. She navigated the complex cultural differences, translated the nuances of each species' intentions, and helped forge a path towards a lasting peace. Humanity agreed to adapt its colonization practices, focusing on sustainable methods that minimize the impact on the frozen ecosystems. The freezers, in turn, agreed to cease their attacks, recognizing humanity's willingness to coexist. As the treaty was signed, a new era dawned on Arion 6, an era of cooperation instead of conflict. The icy planet, once a battlefield, became a symbol of unity, a testament to the power of understanding. Amidst the diplomatic triumphs, Darius found himself drawn closer to Caliph. Their bond, forged in the crucible of conflict, deepened into something more profound. He admired her strength, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to peace. One evening, as they stood together beneath the shimmering aurora borealis, Darius turned to her, his heart filled with warmth. "Caliph," he said softly, "what will you do now? With the treaty signed, your mission is complete." Caliph looked at him, her silver eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took his breath away. "My mission may be complete, but my journey is not. I choose to stay. I choose to help build this new world, together with you." Darius smiled, his heart soaring with joy. He reached out and took her hand, her icy skin sending a familiar shiver through him. But this time, the cold was different. It was a reminder of the barriers they had overcome, the journey they had taken together. As they stood there, hand in hand, beneath the dancing lights of the aurora, Darius knew that their bond was more than just a symbol of unity. It was a promise of a future where differences were celebrated, and hearts, once frozen by fear, could finally thaw in the warmth of love and understanding. The alien maiden had indeed been warmed by human passion, and in turn, had warmed the hearts of an entire galaxy.